With an up-and-coming restriction list, after exploring the possibility of what could be restricted, I am briefly touching on a few unrestrictions in mind. But ultimately, after seeing some of the comments, why can't some cards come back? I had to start by perusing the reasonings of why certain cards are restricted and have a deeper understanding of why they can't come back. And with some restrictions going back as far as Special Booster 1.5, have the times changed enough that the reasonings for these restrictions no longer apply? Because by the end of the video, you might have a change of heart on certain cards that got a restriction, or even a ban. Starting with banned cards, in total there are only 2 cards to look at: Mega Digimon Fusion and BT2 Matt Ishida. Although Mega Digimon Fusion was banned a long time ago, I still think there's too much immunity, specifically Greymon, that can abuse the crap out of this card. Interestingly, if you go back to Bandai's explanation for this ban, it was because cards like BT7 Suzanomon could evo from a tamer in endgames and early or mid-game situations. But if the problem at that time was being too fast, what kind of justification do we have now? With a consideration of only 1 copy, would it necessarily still be a problem? Ultimately, in some ways, it could very well be. But in other ways, you could argue that this option card requiring a white source can be a little bit more difficult today. And coupled with the fact that you have decks that can cheat their Digivolutions in the case of Sakuyamon, or others that can print memory in the case of weregarurumon and Galaxy, does this give a new tool for other decks, or just streamline those decks to be even more powerful? Currently, I'm still of the opinion that this card should be at 0, but some players, especially the chefs of the East, would like to tinker with it at 1 copy. For the BT2 Matt Ishida for purple hybrid decks, the reasoning was simple in that with Duskmon and Velgarmon, it makes great use of cards in the trash. But the explanation for this card was that a 1 card limit would be more difficult to counter. But here's my issue with these types of restrictions. Yes, Matt Ishida is strong, but this requires you to utilize the strong aspect of purple cards in order to find that 1 copy. And with so many cards trashing security, not being able to even play it and then forcing the Duskmon combo to get it back is another. I'm still of the opinion that a ban on Matt Ishida was too harsh, and that in the setting today, decks are much faster than giving you the time to set up. Which leads me to the large number of restrictions that I'm sure many players are wanting to talk about. Starting with the earliest set, we have a lot of green cards to talk about. Argomon, Blossomon, and Hidden Potential Discovered are some cards that have been on the restriction list for a long time. But truth be told, I'm not advocating that Hidden Potential Discovered be removed from the list. Frankly, I wish it to be banned. I personally feel like Hidden Potential Discovered has contributed to high evo costs for a lot of green Digimon. I don't know. In the West, it just feels like there's a design block right there. But for Argomon and Blossomon, I could definitely see a justification on why these could come off the restriction list. For Blossomon at least, there's no inheritable, and you can climb up your chain quickly. While there is an argument that decks like Bloom Lordmon might get the boost in power, you also have to keep in mind with so many decks running Ruin Mode and Medieval Gallantmon, these counteract the ability of green decks that build wide. Now when it comes to Argomon, I'm a little torn on this one. Mainly because I think it'd be a fantastic addition to the meta again, but at what cost when you have cards like Zafagamon? Remember, Zafagamon can still Vortex at end of turn, which means Argomon's inheritable effect is pretty good to spawn out another level 3 Digimon. But again, the downside? Medieval Gallantmon. Keep in mind for this video, I won't necessarily touch on every restricted card, because some of them deserve to be there and deserve to stay there. Promo weregarurumon is another Digimon that I personally think should come off the restriction list. And while there is battle protection and inheritable jamming, Garurumon decks lack any semblance of protection from DP reduction, de-digivolve, and outright deletion. It also amuses me that the description for this restriction was, "A quick defeat is possible using this card." But at the same time, we have so many cards that can decimate security today in 1 turn, and I don't know about you, but early games in the beginning sets of Digimon were very turn 5, maybe turn 6. But today, we're at half that. And plus, there's a lot more interaction. BT2 Gabumon is one of the last Gabumons that had a restriction on it with the use of Apocalypse. And while there were many band-aid fixes to this card, I do think that this card coming back would be okay. True, its explanation at the time was that it could manipulate hands in the early stages of the game. But let's be real, you have so many consistency cards at this point that this card coming back might not be that impactful as you sacrifice the body on board to trigger that inheritable. And as long as Eismon and Eismon Scatter Mode stay on the list at 1, what are you really afraid of? Briefly, Eismon and Eismon Scatter Mode are kind of amusing to me in that they have effects that cycle and play Digimon into the battle area for free. But now with decks like Omnimon Alter S crapping out potentially 2 level 6s, we're justifiably scared of this level 4 still? This could honestly come back as well. But I do agree that Gabumon X, Garurumon X, and Anubismon can all stay in their current place, because honestly, there's too much synergy with the existence of the dog engine. Interestingly, one card I do see purple players floating in discussions is EX2-Impmon. And while there are some ways to recycle this card, I do think being at 4 copies again would create problems for Beelzemon players, especially with the newer support. To that end though, if Bandai ever opens up the semi-restriction list, I definitely think this card is up for contention to earning a place at 2 copies instead of 1. With promo Grankuwagamon, its reasoning for restriction was very similar to promo weregarurumon in that it could defeat opponents in short time and also led to players having few defenses around it. That being said, with Blasted Evolution, single tower stacks are far more susceptible, and even if you're using cards like Tyrant Kabuterimon, those security checks will only last through the turn, and you can't unsuspend unless you have another card effect that allows it. Personally with Jet Sylphimon, I feel the reasoning of, decks that use this card have dominated the meta for longer than anticipated, greatly limiting decks in yellow, no longer really applies in the modern realm of the Digimon card game. Dominating at that time, yes, but in today's meta, it'd be a lot harder. Some Digimon have effects that stop when digivolving effects from happening, and Yellow has largely built an identity outside of Yellow Hybrid, with Yellow Vaccine, Sakuyamon, and even other boss monsters like Mitamamon and Venusmon. And considering BT18 did Zoe Orimoto dirty by color swapping, it's not like you could build a tribal variant of this deck anymore. Simultaneously, we have a lot of cards that can play Tamers, not to mention a lot of cards that can counter DP reduction, either from just being really big, having DP immunity, or simply immunity altogether. Does Sunrise Buster really warrant the restriction to 1 still? Honestly, seeing Marcus Hybrid would be very interesting if that were the case. Mach Galgamon is another funny one in that its restriction hinged solely on the reasoning of being too abusive with BT11 Mirage Galgamon. But now that Mirage Galgamon is at 1, is that really a problem? I'd like to think that with BT11 Mirage hit, this also frees up this level 5 Digimon. Because what other problems are there right now that would or could abuse this card? Sure, this card can spin back level 4 lower Digimon including Floodgates, but with only 1 Mirage Galgamon, is it fair to say that if your opponent finds the 1 of Mirage, they deserve to win? There's only 2 cards left that I want to cover for today's video. Fenrir Lugamon from BT17 is a card that was restricted because it allows you to play Kazuchimon without paying cost, and DNA Digivolving into Fenrir Lugamon Takumi Kazuchi. Its role would allow players to one-shot and discourage players from using other aggressive decks, and reduce the diversity of decks in the game. Interestingly, out of all the restrictions that came to Takumi Kazuchi, I honestly thought the card that would be hit would be Baumon. But this was so much worse. But to some points, I partially agree with this card going to 1. Do I ever see it ever coming back to 4? Personally, I think this card falls more in line with the EX2-Impmon, and is definitely worthy of being a 2 of, should Bandai ever cross the line into semi-restrictions. But the last and final card I want to go over in today's video, surprisingly, the answer is Apocalymon. True, this card has no cost to activate the deck trashing effect, and having multiple was a pain. But before you angrily write in the comments, how dare you DIGI-PANDA, people in the East suffered during this time. You also have to keep in mind that Apocalymon was limited to 1 on December 18th, 2023, with the restriction going into effect March 1st, 2024. Interestingly, from the date that Apocalymon was limited, it would only be a month until Bandai would set a new precedent with pair restrictions. Which makes this question very simple. Or was it the existence of other Digimon with on-play effects? Because if that's the case, what if instead of restricting certain Digimon from being played with Apocalymon, you make Apocalymon restricted to only level 6s with the Dark Master trait? Bandai would learn from this, and with EX10 only allow for Dark Master trait cards to be used with it. Would a restriction like this solve the issue and bring Apocalymon back to 4? On one hand, I can see where players just never want to deal with this again, and on the other, maybe the idea is too restrictive. But this is the only other semi-restricted card I'd love to see if Bandai were to do that. To conclude, I feel like a lot of cards on the restriction list were restrictions primarily to dissuade Bandai from going after the actual problem. Look at all the purple cards that were restricted in order to curb the power and abilities of Apocalymon. But now in more modern times of the game, it does feel like Bandai knows where to go now when it comes to these restrictions. Because restricting super rares, secret rares, indicates that they'll go for the throat rather than cut you off at the knees. But at the same time, with each restriction list, in particular the choice restrictions, I do think this opens up a new precedence on what you can and can't do. I covered a lot of cards today, And obviously this is just one set of opinions that would largely be to open up the community into a discussion on whether certain cards can truly leave the restriction list due to being power crept out in regards to speed or effect. What are your thoughts? And what are you most excited for with the Digimon card game? With only a few more days for a restriction list, it'll then be time to explore the road to Cardfest. This DIGI-PANDA? Logging out.